Namaskar, and welcome to today's deep dive discussion. We're going to be looking at a truly profound chapter in 1920er Dashokar Shramik Sangram, the labor struggles of the 1920s, focusing on the unforgettable story of the Radium Girls. These were marginalized female factory workers whose horrific suffering and honestly incredible resilience basically catalyzed the modern occupational safety laws we all rely on today. If you've ever wondered about কর্মক্ষেত্রে নিরাপত্তার বিবর্তনের ইতিহাস, the history of the evolution of workplace safety, and really, কেন শ্রমিকদের অধিকার রক্ষা করা is just so absolutely essential, well, their story is the foundation of that entire conversation.
Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to imagine a time when glowing in the dark wasn't just a fun novelty, it was literally considered a medical miracle. A 1928 quote from Time magazine captured it perfectly, saying that the world may see streaks of light through the long hours of darkness. Women hired themselves to the U.S. Radium Corporation. These young women were literally bringing light to the darkness for the general public. But the chilling reality? They were paying for that novelty with their own lives. The luminous paint they used was slowly and totally invisibly poisoning them.
Section 1. The Miracle of Radium.
So, to really understand how this happened, we have to travel back to 1917. The U.S. was entering World War I, and young women were flocking to factories in places like New Jersey and Illinois to paint glowing military watch dials. The pay was good, the work seemed easy, and the magic behind this glow was a product called Undark. You see, after Marie Curie discovered radium, it just sparked this massive commercial boom. Back then, radium was widely and completely wrongly touted as a harmless, invigorating health supplement. People were putting it into face creams, chocolates, even toothpaste. So the women painting these dials had absolutely no idea they were handling a highly toxic, radioactive material.
And the specific technique the women were taught to use? That's where this story becomes truly horrifying. To save time and save expensive material, factory managers instructed the workers to point their brushes. This meant they had to lick the brush to a fine tip, dip it into the powdered radium paint, and then paint the dial. Lick, dip, paint, day after day. They were unknowingly ingesting deadly amounts of radium straight into their bodies. And the worst part? The corporate scientists and chemists who actually developed the paint, they knew exactly how dangerous it was. They were in the very same buildings, protecting themselves with lead screens, tongs, and heavy masks.
Section 2. A deadly realization. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the workers responded when things went wrong. By the early 1920s, the women painting these dials started developing these mysterious, devastating illnesses. We're talking severe physical decay, loosened teeth, bloody gums, permanent bone aches, and literally crumbling jaws and limbs. It was horrific. But when medical professionals completely failed them, it was the women themselves who acted as civil scientists. They started connecting the dots between their shared illnesses and their workplace, forming their own hypotheses about the dial painting technique, and tirelessly trying to warn a very skeptical medical community.
But the United States Radium Corporation, or USRC, they did not want to admit fault. Not at all. Instead, they resorted to some incredibly dark corporate smear tactics. For instance, when a worker named Molly Maggia became one of the first to die in 1922, the company falsely blamed her death on syphilis just to ruin her reputation. When an independent Harvard researcher named Dr. Cecil Drinker produced a report proving the factory was completely saturated in toxic radium dust, USRC President Arthur Roeder actively altered those findings before sending them to the Department of Labor. They even went so far as to bribe doctors to attribute the ongoing deaths to other unrelated causes.
Section 3. Fighting the corporation. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what the workers were up against. Before the major lawsuits even gained traction, USRC was quietly paying off the families of early victims to make the problem go away. For example, in 1926, the grieving family of a worker named Hazel Cuser received a meager $1,000 in exchange for a general release, protecting the company from any further litigation. It shows the immense, uphill struggle that would become the Radium Girls in Aini Lurai, their legendary legal battle. The corporation was using its massive resources to just sweep these deaths right under the rug.
So looking at the timeline, the legal process was agonizingly slow, especially for women who were literally running out of time. The factories opened in 1917. The deaths started around 1922, but major lawsuits weren't really initiated until 1925. And a massive hurdle they faced was a strict 2-year statute of limitations in New Jersey. Because radiation poisoning takes years to actually manifest, by the time the women even realized they were sick, their legal window to sue had technically closed. They literally had to fight in a court of equity from their sickbeds just to get their cases heard.
By 1928, 5 New Jersey workers famously took USRC to court, but the reality of their victory was absolutely heartbreaking. By the time of their very first court appearance in January of that year, the women were so frail that 2 were entirely bedridden. Not a single one of the 5 could even raise their arm to take the oath. Because they knew they wouldn't survive a long, drawn-out trial, they ended up agreeing to a settlement in the autumn of 1928 before a jury could even deliberate.
Let's break down that settlement. Each of the 5 women received a $10,000 lump sum, a $600 annual pension, and they had their ongoing medical and legal expenses completely covered by USRC. In terms of labor history, it was a landmark victory for workers' rights. But sadly, the victory was completely hollow for the plaintiffs themselves. Despite winning that financial security for their final days, all 5 of these brave women passed away by the 1930s.
Section 4. The Media Battle.
The tragedy also sparked a massive media battle that really highlights the deep societal divides of the 1920s. The contrasting coverage is fascinating to look at. Mainstream media, like the New York Times, provided very hesitant, careful coverage. Early on, they completely refused to assign blame to the USRC, clearly treading lightly to avoid offending a powerful corporation. On the flip side, radical leftist papers like the Daily Worker took an entirely different approach. They heavily sensationalized the suffering of the women, explicitly focusing on their physical decay to aggressively critique the entire economic system. So the crucial point is how the Daily Worker framed this. They published statements like, "The capitalist system is a system of murder for profit." They used these horrific workplace abuses to advocate for the complete destruction of capitalism. To them, the Radium Girls weren't just victims of one bad company. They were presented as the inevitable result of a system that valued profit over human life. It's an impartial reminder of how radical media used the suffering of the working class as a rhetorical strategy for sweeping systemic change, a tactic we definitely still see echoing in modern political movements today.
Section 5. A legacy of safety. Let's move to and see how this builds into their lasting impact, because we really have to recognize Radium Girls or Obadan, the contribution of the Radium Girls, and Korma Katri Niropatrika Gurutwa, the sheer importance of workplace safety. Their legacy is absolutely monumental. They established the right for individual workers to sue corporations for labor abuse damages. Their specific case created the legal and safety baseline of provable suffering, which directly spurred Congress to pass occupational disease compensation laws. Because of them, that deadly lip-pointing technique ended forever, and their struggle directly paved the way for the eventual creation of OSHA.
But as we know, change, especially corporate change, can be agonizingly slow. Despite everything the Radium Girls proved in the 1920s, and despite radium paint being slowly phased out over the following decades, it wasn't until the shocking year of 1978 that the absolute last factory manufacturing radium paint in the United States finally shut its doors. 1978.
Which leaves us with a really vital question to ponder today. As we rapidly adopt new, untested technologies and materials in our modern industries, what is the true cost of workplace safety? And who ultimately pays the price if we get it wrong? The Radium Girls paid with their lives so that future generations wouldn't have to. Dhonnabad for joining Alochanai this discussion today, and may their story remind us to always advocate for a safer world.